it's time to eat crow, I guess, for both of us here as we jump into the first team, because the Avella Eagles, a team we completely misjudged out of the gate last year. I mean, we saw that they had almost their entire team returning when we previewed them before last season began. But I think we were both really cautious because, the Avella Eagles had, like 1 or 2 wins in the past 4 years, something like that. And we didn't really think a lot of it. And then Avella came out, they won their first 2 against, I think it was Jefferson and Monessen, which, take it what you will, those could have been both winnable games as it was. But then pulling in against West Green on a Thursday night, West Green coming off of a COVID pause and beating them. Just a fantastic season from Avella, beating Carmichael's in their home finale. The fireworks lighting up there as they beat the Mighty Mikes, and then going to the playoffs where Jeanette ended up, pounding them on the road. But Avella still returns a lot from last year as we take a look into next season. Just give me your overall thoughts here of the Eagles as they head into the 2021 season.
Yeah, the Eagles, they should be flying high and mighty. No pun intended. No pun intended there with them being the Eagles. No, but seriously, I mean, they lost their biggest playmaker in Tanner Terensky to graduation, so that's going to be a big loss. But look for it to be really the KJ Rush show this year. KJ Rush on both sides of the ball as a very stout quarterback who can air it down the field and run over some people. And then on defense at middle linebacker, really take over a game. And that's what he did against West Green that night in Rogersville. West Green, they, like you mentioned, they were on a COVID pause. There was a COVID outbreak in the school. Didn't play against California. They didn't practice for almost 2 weeks. And they only had about 2 days of preparation for Avella. And Avella came out and put together a great second half and upset the Pioneers early in the season, and that really put Avella on everybody's radar. And this team is on the radar of people now. Now they know what this team has. Yes, they lost their best offensive playmaker, as I said, but this Eagles team isn't a pushover this year, and people know that. But there also means there's a target on the Eagles' back this year, so they got to remember that too. Stay humble, remember who they are. And Avella will be a really great team this year and possibly make a run at the playoffs again.
Yeah, and you mentioned Tanner Terensky, and the Avella Eagles kind of came out last year with a mindset of, hey, we have this guy named Tanner Terensky. He might be the best player on the field in a lot of these games we're going to play, so you know what? We're just going to try to air the ball out to him, target him as much as we can. And KJ's arm probably felt a little sore in some of those games for how much they were throwing it to Terensky. But with his graduation, I mean, the doors are open for, a Noah Markle and Austin Euler, Brandon Samuel, guys on offense and, weapon positions that can make up that loss of production. Where do you see kind of that gap in production coming from this year? Do you think it kind of fills in those gaps, by committee, or is there one guy that we should probably have our eyes out for?
2 answers. I'm going to say yes, by committee. Guys are going to have to step up as they always do. But Samuel, in my opinion, had the better game of the 2 when you mentioned him and Terensky against West Green last year. So I think he's going to be the number 1 receiver on this team coming in. Noah Markle had another great game against West Green when I think of it. But I thought I was more impressed with Samuel against West Green than I was Terensky, not taking anything away from Tanner. But Samuel really came in, dominated, and I think West Green knew they had Terensky, and I think they keyed on him too much because that really opened it up for Samuel, and I believe he had 2 touchdowns in that game. So, like I said, I think it's going to be a group effort, as it always is, but look for Brennan Samuel to get a lot of the touches like Tanner Terensky did last year for the Eagles.
Yeah, and I'd also be interested to see whether it's just a bit more of a balanced attack from them as well. And you got, basically both of your runners back in Markle and Euler. That type of production, that can help you if you're trying to fill in some holes on the outside. But you mentioned Samuel. I mean, Cole Davidson, also Stephen Welch. These guys all have experience at receiver. So if they wanted to go the more air raid route on offense, I'm sure that is definitely a possibility. going in the trenches, though, I mean, they lose Robert West. They lose a couple of their key pieces in the interior and on the defensive line especially. But, they got Brian Humensky back. Harrison Fisher is back. What are you looking for as far as guys down in the middle of the line? Do you see that, still being a strength of this team even heading into the next year?
Yeah, and it's going to have to. If they expect to be the quote-unquote air raid team that they were last year, they're going to need to give time for KJ Rush to find a receiver downfield. And even in the run game, and that's what really impressed me against the West Green game. I know I keep going back to that game, but I was on the call for that game, so I got a bird's-eye view of the action and really got to see what Avella was all about. And Avella really, they don't run to set up the pass, they pass to set up the run, and really opened up some big holes. Cercerello was their big carrier last year. Noah Markle got a couple carries as well. Halfback draws was a big play for them, 5-6 yards a play. Really got the ball moving, wore out the West Green defense. And then they'd hit Terensky and Samuel on slants and out routes. And that's what they're going to have to do again this year. But the line's going to, like I said, line's coming back in, didn't lose a lot. So they're going to be pretty solid, maybe even one of the better lines in this year's Tri-County South Conference.
And then, again, just to recap their season last year, upsetting Carmichael's at the end of the year, a game that Carmichael's had to win to make the playoffs, and then Avella upset them to get into the playoffs as that final seed. Although they weren't a wild card, they ended up playing the 3-seeded Jeanette, and Jeanette just laid a pounding on them. But, there's the extended playoffs this year, which means that out of this 8-team conference, 5 are going to make the playoffs, and that basically guarantees the Eagles a playoff spot. So when you start looking to the postseason, do you see the Eagles as maybe one of those more dangerous teams, when it comes into early November, late October, that maybe you see an Avella play like an Olsh or a Rochester, and you say, hey, maybe Avella could maybe, get that upset and take that next step in the playoffs?
Well, for Avella, I don't know. Like you said, like last year, they made the playoffs, and their reward was the eventual WPIL champs and PIAA 1A runner-ups and Jeanette. So if Avella's going to want to win a couple playoff games, they're really going to have to get on a roll and get that first playoff win, first one since 1976 when they won the the WPIL championship. They get that one playoff win in as a higher seed. They'll almost have to win the conference or get the second seed, host a playoff game, get a more favorable matchup, win that game, and then have a little momentum and confidence boost heading into possibly a game with, we'll say, Clairton or, like you mentioned, Rochester, Jeanette, and what have you. So, Avella, very much could be a threat come November out of the Tri-County South if they can pull off upsets like they did last year.
And then looking at this upcoming schedule here, they play an out-of-conference game against Mapletown to open up the season. They return to that rivalry where they play 2 games a year, and one of them doesn't count. But then they go to Fort Cherry, which is, a regional rivalry for them, home against Burgettstown, and then they start out conference play. With Jefferson Morgan. And do you think this is a team that you're looking at those first 4 games that Avella could certainly win those first 4 heading into, a home statement game against West Green possibly?
Yeah, that's one thing. Avella's schedule is very favorable, especially early in the season, like you mentioned. Looking at their schedule, at Mapletown, 1 of 2, that's going to be a big test right off the bat. We'll talk about Mapletown here a little later. Fort Cherry, that's a big rivalry game. Fort Cherry's been down as of late. I think that should be an easy win. Burgettstown will be a tough one. That's another regional rivalry. If they can pull that game off, that's really going to open some eyes up for people. And then Jefferson should be an easy win. And then hosting West Green, where they've had some success in years past when West Green comes to Avella, and they beat them at West Green last year. So watch that game, and then at California, that's going to be a tough one. We know California, they got the game of the week last year for when they hosted California. We know what Damani Stafford, Jaden Zuzek did to the Eagles that game. But yeah, this Avella team could really open things up, kind of like they did last year. And who knows? They could be 5-0 heading into California.
Yeah, and it sets up for them to where they could be playing their best football of the year in the middle of the season and have their two toughest games there as well in West Green, California. But yeah, I mean, Avella team that is very much on playoff watch, very much in the top 5 teams in this conference, and a lot coming back. So a lot to be excited for from the Eagles.